Good afternoon. Welcome to part 3 of our employee self-service forms webinar. Today we're going to be talking about building an HTML form, so getting a little deeper from a technical point of view, and we'll be touching on security and workflows and sort of the whole scenario around an expense form. Before we dive in, I want to kind of set the stage here. There's certainly some rough edges. I didn't get as far on this particular demo scenario as I was hoping to. I don't know what I was thinking when I booked these webinars 2 in this week. I've got to go live for a big project we've been working on for the last year that starts at 8 p.m. tomorrow night. So needless to say, it's been a hectic week. And what I may end up doing is record another little session next week sometime when the dust is settled with some of the last bits that we want to hang in on here. But we've got enough to give you the concept, and we've got some code that we can share out. I think we've got a good session for you today. But for those of you that weren't on the previous sessions, I suppose I should introduce myself. My name is Peter Carson. I'm the president of Extranet User Manager and also an Office Apps and Services MVP. Contact info is here. We're going to publish the slides up as well as recording, so you'll have all the details there. A little background on Extranet User Manager. I'm going to skip in interest of time because I think most folks have probably been on the previous webinars through there. So let me turn my camera off here just so we have a little more screen real estate. And we'll go through the agenda. I literally didn't spend a lot of time reviewing the deck with the last changes in here, so the agenda is not entirely accurate. We're not going to be talking about the leave request form that was on the last session. We're going to dive into the expense form and the technology around that, and some of the details in terms of building out the employee information you need to support processes like this. We've got the Q&A open, so we'll be taking questions as we go through. We've got Andrew and Amanda on the line moderating that. So they'll answer as best they can through there, and then as we get towards the end, we'll pause and have a look back at those questions. We do have a forms poll here. So Amanda, if you want to take that link and put it out in the Q&A. Whoops, we don't have Logan who we normally have. He's about to become a new dad today, so we're running one short from a shorthanded point of view. You know what? I think these are pretty much the same questions we were asking in the previous webinar as well. Why don't we just go ahead and skip this particular section here? All right, so let's get down to the meat of things. Let's talk about the Envision IT expense report. So this was actually a sort of a proof of concept project that we built a little over a year ago, and I was giving a similar talk. We hadn't really touched it for some time. We dusted it off sort of the end of last year because we had a client who was interested in using this as sort of the basis for a much richer, broader expense form implementation. It's a government client, a couple of thousand employees, SAP, so obviously a more complex scenario. And actually, I'm going to talk about that scenario. That project's not completely finished, so we can't share client details and get into a full case study. We are planning on sharing that when that's ready, but I can take you through some of the technology challenges on that side of things and where that came from. But this version is a fairly stripped down version. It's really all we need from an Envision IT point of view. We're only 18 staff, so our needs aren't too complex. You know, we want to capture the employee name and date, any sort of itemized expenses and mileages, details. The form auto calculates totals from that in terms of what are the total expense and mileage items. It uses formulas for the CRA, the Canadian Revenue Agency, approved mileage rates. So it takes the kilometers and figures out the dollar total from that, and then allows you to submit that from there. Now, what we're not showing on this form that we do have on that other client one, we actually want to pull back in here is the ability to actually attach attachments to that as well to say, hey, I've got maybe scans of receipts and things like that I want to pull in as part of that. Can I bring that in as part of that? We've built that on the other side. We're going to be bringing that in on this side as well. So let's just talk about some of the points to consider that we need to deal with. So if you were on my talk 2 days ago on the leave request, we made a decision on that one to say, you know what, it's a very simple form. There's only 5 fields that you fill out on that. If you change your mind, you want to cancel or you want to change the dates that are on your leave request, just cancel the request altogether and submit a new one. It's not an onerous task to do that. Expense forms are a little different. There tends to be a lot more information in there. You know, if you've filled out, you know, a dozen different expense items and submitted that, and then finance has come back and said, hey, you're missing receipts for one of those items, you don't want to start that whole process over again. So it is important for these ones to be able to modify after submitting. So that kind of takes away the Microsoft Forms option. This is obviously a more complex form. We need that ability to load up previously filled out ones and make changes to them and resubmit them. Microsoft Forms is not going to let us do that. So that's what drove us down the path of saying, hey, we need a different Forms approach here. Now, we could have built it as a Power Apps. That is another option definitely through there. But as an organization, we are a development shop. We've got lots of strong developers who understand web stack development, can build HTML and JavaScript and CSS and really create a compelling user experience from that point of view. And often it's easier for them to work right in web stack tools of choice rather than a tool like Power Apps. Sometimes those tools, they're designed to make the development simpler. And for a non-developer, that can be true. But for a true developer, those tools can sometimes get in the way. There's also the question around licensing, and we'll touch on that side as well. So, that modify after submitting really drove the technology choice around how we were going to build the form. We need to be able to reject it, revise it, resubmit it, lock it down once finance approves it. I mentioned the ability to scan and attach receipts, so having a document attachment as part of that. And then this last part is important as well, to say, hey, these may need to be retained as records for many years. Maybe you've got a 7-year retention policy on expense reports. 7 years from now, are you going to be running the same expense system? Maybe not. Maybe you've implemented an ERP and it's taking care of that because it's got an HRIS component to it, and you really need these as just archive points. Want to keep the system up and running. So when we build something like this, we want to think about that retention and end of life. Is there ability to perhaps just PDF the final submitted expense form, including all the receipts, and then that can be marked as a record and retention rules apply to that. We don't have that piece in there just yet. Got some clear ideas on how we would do that. And then we use TelPay both for our payroll, our vendor payments, and for our employee reimbursements. So, the ability to export out of this system and into TelPay to do those electronic payments is something we want to do there as well. So that's basically what we wanted to achieve. We're still very much in the POC stage on it. As I mentioned, we'd like to implement some more of these pieces in here, and maybe we can send you a follow-up recording of what that looks like from there. But let's have a look at the underlying architecture of what this looks like. And if we start on the left-hand side here, we've got the expense form, which is an HTML form. It's running in what's called a, I don't have the wrong label in there, it's actually not a web API. It's running in an Azure App Service, which is basically a version of IaaS, a web server up in the cloud that Microsoft manages for you. It's a super easy way to deploy web applications. Even though this is purely client-side, there's no server-side component to it, it's still a nice way to deploy that out. We'll walk you through what that looks like. When somebody fills that form out, it gets submitted to a Logic app. So in Tuesday sessions with the leave request, I was showing you Power Automate, and I'll talk about why I've got both of these in here in a minute. But basically, the form does an AJAX post to a HTTP endpoint in the Logic app, and that's what triggers the workflow to validate everything that's been entered in and record it into SharePoint. So it's getting written into to an expense list. Actually, this should be kind of in between here. The reason I've got a Power Automate, and I don't have this actually live in here to show just yet, is that while there are approval steps in Logic apps, they're pretty rudimentary. And Power Automate's got a really nice automation component to it that I'd like to leverage in here. Now, from a licensing point of view, yes, I could submit the expense form directly to the Power Automate and kind of eliminate some of the complexity in here. The challenge is that that needs to use an HTTP endpoint on Power Automate. As soon as you do that, then you're into premium licensing. And I want to keep these solutions on standard licensing as much as possible to keep the potential audience as broad as possible. So think about this expense list in the middle here. What happens is the Logic app submits to the expense list, and then the Power Automate can trigger on a new item showing up in there, and it can then drive the approvals workflows from there. And as I talked about in Tuesday's session, there's rich support now in Microsoft Teams for Power Automate approvals. I really like that. We've gone full hold into Teams as an organization. So anything we can get out of email and into Teams is a good thing. So all that same approval that I was showing in the leave request will work the same way here within this part of it as well. So if you missed Tuesday session, I encourage you to look back in the recording at that one. I'm not going to repeat that part of it, but that whole ability to build that whole approval process around Microsoft Teams is a key part of this solution. And then also coming from Tuesday's session, I will get into this a little bit, but again, I covered it in a fair amount of detail in Tuesday's session, is how we pull together employee data. We can have these workflows reach straight into Azure Active Directory and pull out manager information, employee information, things like that we need as part of this process. But it's actually nice to have that all prepared for us. So we have some PowerShell that's running in Azure Automation. So if we think about the app service as a serverless way to host your web applications, Azure Automation is a serverless place to host your PowerShell scripts and your batch jobs. So basically there's a batch job that runs here that reaches into Azure Active Directory, gets all the employee data, including their employee ID, their department, their manager information, and populates all that into SharePoint. And it makes it very easy for us to consume that within our workflows in here. So that feeds into the process and ultimately updates things in the expense list. And then we can use things like Power BI dashboard to analyze the results coming out from there. So it looks fairly complex, but what I'm trying to distill out here is that there's a pattern that we're following. And that's really the theme for this talk is what pattern do you want to follow for your architecture? And once you've got a bunch of these pieces in place, like the ability to harvest and organize all of your employee data, all of your various workflows and forms can consume that. And if you've got a pattern to how you securely store that into SharePoint and have the right permissions around that, again, you can leverage that across all of your processes. Because typically there's many different employee self-service examples. And once you've got this pattern in place, you can then extend and build more processes from there. Now, I mentioned a client implementation that kind of went in the middle. We had our early POC we've implemented for a client, and now we're kind of simplifying down and taking lessons learned from that back into our version. This one was a lot more complex. It's a little hard to see on the screen here because it is very much a hybrid organization. They're still very much on-premise. So everything happens from an on-premise Active Directory. Yes, they do have Azure AD Connect that syncs those users up into Azure AD in the cloud. But their SharePoint is still on premises. So this SharePoint here is actually a SharePoint 2019, not a SharePoint Online. Now we can still do things like leverage logic apps out in the cloud and interact with the on-premise SharePoint. We use what's called an on-premise data gateway. So this is a component from Microsoft that you install in your on-premise environment, and it allows things in the cloud to interact with things like SQL and SharePoint in your on-premise environment. And then I don't show it on this diagram here, but there's actually SAP to the left of this. So all the employee data is in SAP and feeding down into Active Directory. And we want to be able to pull down and push up expense information to SAP. So we're using a PowerShell batch jobs to do that here. Normally we would run those in Azure Automation in the cloud, but because we're interacting with everything on premise, we're just running that on a scheduled server on premises. So we can reach into the SharePoint 2019, feed in the SAP uploads and staff profile information, and then get those expenses that have been approved by managers in finance and pull that out so that SAP can have jobs to import that information into the finance systems. So obviously a fair bit more work to building this out. We were hoping to launch this in January. We're a little behind getting the last details out and going from that. But we're down to the last one or two issues raised by the business and getting ready to launch this out. So I'll look for a case study and some background on this solution. It's an interesting one coming out from that. So I mentioned a couple of technologies here. One is Azure Logic Apps, and I touched on this in Tuesday's session, but we didn't go into too much detail because we were focused more on Power Automate. But Logic Apps is the platform underneath Power Automate. It's actually the same designer. I'm going to show side by side the Leave Request Power Automate that I was using in Tuesday's session and the Logic app that we're using today. We've actually done some improvements literally in the last 48 hours since the last webinar to sort of modularize and better organize things on the Logic app side. We could do the same thing on the Power Automate, so we'll probably bring those back on that side. This is nice because it is sort of more of a developer tool, and we're taking a developer approach to this flavor of the solution, less of a low-code citizen developer type of approach. We've got things like Visual Studio integration, the ability to integrate into Azure DevOps and pipelines. I'm going to talk more about this in a future talk around software development lifecycle, how we can do things like continuous integration, where we track all the changes through Git, for example, and have a pipeline that pushes that out through ARM templates into dev and test and production environments. So having a properly scaled, non-prod and prod environments around that. So really bringing enterprise software development lifecycle practices into these cloud approaches. And then I mentioned Azure App Services. So this is platform as a service. Basically what that means is you control the platform, but Microsoft manages it as a PaaS service for you. So things like managing the servers themselves, patching them, upgrading them, if something fails on them, substituting in a new server from there. Microsoft takes care of all of that. You don't need to worry about that. You just pick a size and a number of nodes that you want. You can set up rules to auto scale it up and down. And Microsoft provides a 99.5% uptime SLA that's financially backed around that. So that's a little bit on the technology background side of things. Let's actually flip over onto the demo side and show you what the actual forms look like. Amanda, I'd given you a link to the expense form. Why don't you go ahead and share that out in the Q&A? And actually everybody will be able to interact with this. It will prompt you for a Microsoft login. Don't worry, this is not a phishing attack. We're not trying to scrape your credentials. If you look at the URL, it will be login.microsoftonline.com that you're going to. We just haven't locked down the form to only staff within the organization. We intentionally left it open so anybody can hit the form and see it through their own 365 credentials. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up an in private window here. And I'm just going to launch to the expense form. So this is the same experience that you would see if you were launching out. And as soon as you launch, depending on whether you're logged in already or not, you may or may not see yourself going to login.microsoftonline.com. I'm in private, I haven't logged in yet, so I have to log in with credentials. I'm going to use one of our test users here. And I'll show you a little later in the talk how we set up this authentication. It's actually really easy to do with app services. So I'll go ahead and sign in. And I get my expense form. And you can see here the employee email is coming up. So we've got some code that's pulling that information from your signed in profile and embedding it into the form. Now, we could show more information. We could show manager, employee information. What we'd need to do is reach into SharePoint to the employee data files for that and present that up on the form. We haven't gone there just yet on this version of the form, but that's all certainly doable from that perspective. So let's go through and just fill the form out. So we'll say, hey, it's today's date that I'm filling out on. We're missing some things like some field headings in there. Like I said, it's still a little bit rough on that side. So what it's looking for here is just some notes. Let's say I went out for lunch. Haven't done that in a year, but imagine a world where we still get to do that. And first time doing it, let's have a nice lunch. And I can add new rows in through here and add additional items if I want from that. I'm just going to leave the one in there for now. And likewise, I can do some mileage to say, hey, where was I going? I was heading to lunch. And how many kilometers was that? Let's say it's 50 kilometers. So it auto calculates the 55 cents or 59 cents, I guess it is, per kilometer CRA rate that applies for mileage less than 5,000 kilometers. In that other example that I was showing you, we get a little more sophisticated. We actually track the year-to-date mileage, and if somebody bumps over that 5,000 kilometer mark, then we change the rate so it's all still within boundaries from a CRA point of view. And we see the totals update live as we're making changes here. So I can see my $50 total from expense items, my $27.50 from my mileage, and my grand total of $77.50. So I put some notes in here. Go ahead and submit that. All right, so let's flip now over to the back end side and have a look at what's happening there. So let's start with the app service itself. So here I am in the Azure app service. So this URL that you see here is the same URL that Amanda chatted out that you go to see the form. This is the top level URL of the site. You need a little subpath on there to get into the expenses from there. Now, this is published under azurewebsites.net. You do have ability to control that. So you can actually set up your own custom domain in here. You have to prove that you own the domain, so you have to put some DNS records in to do that. I mean, you can actually set it up under SSL under your own certificate. What I like to do though, if I come into the private certificates here, yeah, there's the ability. I actually need to set up the DNS on it, but there's the ability to create a free SSL certificate that's managed by Microsoft for your domain. Again, you need to prove ownership of the domain, but once you've done that, Microsoft takes care of that for you, which is wonderful. And you know, our organization, like many, have had websites go down because somebody forgot to apply the renewed certificate to it. In the app service, when you use the certificate features in there, Microsoft takes care of that and auto renews the certificates. You don't need to pay for them. You need to do anything. It just all happens. So it's all part of the beauty of a managed app service through there. So in our case, if we wanted this to be employeeselfservice.envisionit.com, we can absolutely do that. This is a dev site, so we tend to leave them on the azurewebsites.net from there. Now, if I come through in a bit more in here, let's have a look at a couple of the other things. So authentication authorization, you can see here we've got app service authentication turned on, and we've got it set to log in with Azure Active Directory. Now we've configured it that we allow any Azure AD to come in. We could lock that down and say, hey, we just want our staff to be able to come in here. We don't want externals to come in. It's kind of nice the way it is right now because anybody on the call can actually try that out. And you can even bring in other authentication providers if you want to have Facebook or Google or Twitter or Microsoft accounts coming in. That federation is all set up for you there as well. I mean, you have to do some things on the Facebook side in terms of registering an app and getting client IDs and such to wire that together, but it's all doable from that perspective. Easiest though is to use Azure Active Directory. And in employee self-service, where we're talking about a Microsoft Cloud, that just makes total sense. So that's on the authentication side of things. From the scaling perspective, what we can do is decide what tier we want this to run on. We're actually using a free tier on here right now. There's not a lot that this app is using. One of the downsides of the free tier is it does go to sleep. So, first person in each day that hits this form has to wait for that to wake up and go from there. We could have a production style shared or premium or standard or premium and have wake up scripts and pings on those to keep it alive, to make it a little more responsive from that point of view. I mean, we get 60 minutes per day of compute. In our case, we're actually doing zero compute because all we're doing is serving up static HTML files. So you choose what's appropriate and you pay based on that. And then you can also scale out to say, okay, how many nodes do I want for this resource? I'm using a free plan right now, so I don't have the ability to do auto scale. But if I was in the standard or the premium plans, I choose how many nodes I want. You have to choose at least 2 nodes if you want an SLA. So there's no SLA on the free plans for Microsoft. The reason for that is that Microsoft wants to know that if one of their servers fails, there's a second one there ready, and they detect that and they would bring up a replacement for the failed one, but you wouldn't see any difference from an SLA point of view because the one server would carry the load while it brought the second one back in from there. What scale out allows you to do is define rules to say, hey, maybe based on CPU or traffic load or numbers of users against those nodes, actually start adding nodes to that. So you can flexibly say, hey, if we have a morning hit where everybody hammers this, we can set up a time on that, or we can just let it detect the increased load on it and start adding nodes to that. And then as it gets quiet and scales back down, you can start removing nodes away. And basically that multiplies out. So if we think about the plans that we had here, if I was paying I forget what that number was, it's still figuring out, say it's $75 a month, that's per node. So if I have 2 nodes, it would be $150. And if it scales up to 3 or 4 or 5 nodes, then it becomes times 3, 4, or 5 instead of times 2. But it's not for the month, it's for literally the hours that you use it. So if, on an average week, there's 2 hours every morning where you need it to be bigger and you scale it up, then you're consuming 10 hours at the bigger amount, and all the rest, 744 hours a month minus those 10 hours times 4 weeks is a much smaller number at the lower level from there. So it becomes very cost effective to be able to scale it from that point of view. And if I keep going down through here, there's a lot more things in here. I can set up custom networks. So maybe I've got express route connections from my organization right into Azure, and I want everything on a private network that's not on the public internet, you can set up all the networking and manage things from that point of view. So you can get quite sophisticated in terms of how you manage that out. There's application insights that you can set up to provide monitoring and analytics, so instrumenting on there. Alerts can drive off of that, so you can have your operations team notified if there's issues. Again, a lot of flexibility that you can do there. If we come down into the app service editor, we just launch that out into a new tab here. I can actually get under the hood inside of the app service and have a look at what's running inside that. So I can actually see here's my expenses folder, and I've got a number of files in there. I can actually live see those files. In fact, from a development point of view, sometimes what we do, in fact, we've been doing that on this project here, it's just live editing in here, saving it. It's got a nice HTML editor right in that experience. And when I come back to refresh my form here, I live see that change going on in there. So it makes it very easy for our developers to work from that point of view. We use Azure DevOps to manage those source components. So, it's important to make sure that those changes always make it back into DevOps and get properly checked in as part of that. And then as we get into the deployment side of things, this can all get packaged up into an ARM template and deployed out into another Azure environment. So let's say we're doing this work in our dev environment, we can deploy it out in a test or a UAT environment, and then ultimately into a production environment from there. So we can have gates, and we can have a very nice process around how we manage that deployment side of things. So that's all on the form side. And I submitted that form, but let's go have a look at what actually happens under the hood there. So I've got here an ESX expense form submit logic app. So this is the logic app that's running as part of that. In fact, if I refresh that, we'll see that 12/19 today, there was a form submitted. That was me doing the test one in there. So let's have a look at that and what's actually inside that. So there's sort of two views we can look at the logic app. This is showing me an actual run and what happened through it. And then there's an editor view where we can actually edit from there. So it gets kicked off when an HTTP request is received. So this is the JavaScript in the form, which I'll show you in a minute, posting to this logic app. And it's posting a bunch of data. We can see the structured data that's coming through in here. It's actually nicely organized from a JSON point of view. So I can see my top level employee information, my itemized expenses. So there's my lunch for $50, my mileage heading to lunch, $27.50, my notes, the totals that were calculated, always discrete things within the JSON in there. So that's great. So then I can start to work through that. Often you'll see a debug variable. We just throw that in so we can check things as steps through there. It's not part of the process. But what we want to do is send back a response to the form saying everything's okay on that. Now we're doing this early in the process. Part of what we want to do is put some validation around the security and the user info first, and then pass the response back. So if somebody submits and they're doing something wrong, they're trying to hack the system, we can detect that. We can pass back access denied or 500 errors through the HTTP responses and communicate that back up to the JavaScript. So there's still a little more tightening up to do from a error control and security point of view, but that's basically what's happening there. Now this is an important point here. We just started doing this on this one. We don't see the same on the Power Automate that we did on Tuesday, where we've actually modularized and broken the logic app into sub logic apps. So what happens when the form gets submitted? We want to make sure that it's properly secured. We want the form authenticated through Azure AD. So remember, when I launched my in private window, I had to sign in through Azure AD. But when the submit happens, we want that to happen securely as well. We don't want somebody to be able to just look at the JavaScript, discover the endpoints, and just start randomly posting things to the logic app. We want to throw those away if they're not properly secured. So if I bring up developer toolbar here and I look at the actual content, so here's my HTML and my form, but the important part is the actual submission. So down here we see the actual submit button. When somebody clicks that button, what happens? What calls this function that needs to do a bunch of things? So here's the URL for the logic app itself. I mean, we're going to want to parameterize that and put that somewhere else so that as we move between different environments, it can connect to different logic apps. But right now, we've just got it hard-coded in there. And basically what we do is we spin through all the form fields on the HTML form and serialize that data up. And we're doing it in a way that's fairly flexible. We're using serialized arrays within this. So if I look at my actual HTML, my form, we've structured the form into different sections in here. So we've got sort of our top level employee info. We've got our itemized expenses. We've got the mileage information in here. And we've got our totals and notes from there. So what happens is the HTML is basically going through those different sections and building up an object here with all that data. And I'll show you in a minute a submit. We'll set some breakpoints in here and actually walk through what that looks like. But the big thing is that if we change our mind on the form and we add some new fields in here, we don't actually need to change this code here. In fact, the goal here was to make this code as generic as possible. We haven't split it out into its own supporting library, but as I was talking about before, if you've got multiple different business process forms, they could start to leverage a common JavaScript library for doing this serializing of data and submitting that to the Logic app. So once we've got all that data, this is where the security part comes in. We've got a piece that we have modularized out called get token. So if I come over to this expense form security.js, we'll see here, this is doing an AJAX call out to Azure AD, and it's basically getting what's called a bearer token. So we're in an authenticated browser session. We had to log in when we came in. We can call to Azure AD and say, give me a token that I can call other things like Logic apps and pass that bearer token to. And because it's a assigned secure token, when it goes over to Logic apps can pass it to Azure AD and say, hey, is this a valid token? And who's it from? And everything's solid and together from a security point of view. So not a lot in here. It's a fairly simple bit of JavaScript to go out and get that token from this AJAX call. And basically the results of that gets passed back, and that becomes part of the header. So you see here in the request header, it's adding the prefix bearer to that, which is how it needs to go into the header, and the token that came back from Azure AD. And Logic apps, we'll show you in a minute, uses that to authenticate that the person's coming in properly. And then it's filling out the post from there and saying, okay, I'm going to take that data that came off of the form, stringify it, and post it as the body of the post from there. And it's got some error handling to say, hey, did that come back successfully, or was there an error in there? So let's do this. Let's actually set a breakpoint. So you can do this yourself, and you actually see it live going through, because you go into developer toolbar, look at all this code based on that link that we shared out, and see how that works. So let me flip over here for a second. Back to the form. Now I'm not going to bother filling anything in on it. I'm just going to go ahead and hit the submit on it. And we've hit our breakpoint here. And developer toolbar in both Chrome and Edge is quite nice. It shows me details so I can see the things that were filled in through there. Like that's my security token. It looks like gobbledygook. It's basically a base64 encoded binary string that came back from Azure AD that's secure to pass over to the Logic app from there. And if I look at my item, if I just hover over that, I can actually see that structure. So there's my employee info with all my details, and I can keep drilling down to see, oh, that's staff 2, that's who I'm signed in as. My itemized expenses in this case isn't going to have anything in there because I didn't bother filling any in. But if I come down to my totals, whoops, sometimes if you hover off, it gets a little tricky. Go ahead and expand my totals. I can see my grand total, expense items, mileage. So this is everything that's going to get packaged up and sent across. So I can go ahead and just let that continue. We can see back on our form, hey, we've been submitted successfully. In fact, if I look back on my Logic app, let me just refresh that. There's my new run that just came through. Now, and again, I can see the data that came through as part of that. Yeah, I don't have any expenses and items, but I do have my 0 totals. Everything's looking good from that perspective. So as I'm working in the Logic app, it's actually pretty straightforward to navigate through this data that came across. So as I said before, if we add some new fields to the form, the JavaScript doesn't need to change, which was one of our design goals. Obviously, I'd need to make some changes in the Logic app if I wanted to make use of those values, but I'll actually show you a further abstraction that we've done to simplify that side of things. So it's calling out to this validate bearer token function here. In this view here, we don't actually see those details. But if I come, let me open a new tab here. And let me just go into the resource group for this section. So this is our employee self-service. So these are all the things we've got deployed up into Azure. We've got our app service. We have a couple of other app services that we should delete that were earlier versions through there. The app insights on that, the plan, which is sort of the underlying payment for that app service. And here we've got our different logic apps, and there are some connectors because we're connecting up to SharePoint Online later in the process. But it's this validate bearer token sub logic app that I wanted to bring up. And we actually see that run that just happened as the one logic app called out to the other one. This one's a little complicated. I can't claim ownership on this one. Dinesh, who's our director of development, he created this one for me, did a great job of figuring out the underlying Azure AD. This is something we should probably share out. Trying to figure it out is a little tough, but once you've got the template for the logic app, it becomes pretty easy from that point of view to say, hey, I want to parse those headers that came across with that bearer token that got passed across to me. You've got to do some stripping out of that to get the token in its base 64, and then just get the value from that, decode that. And there's a number of scenarios of what that base 64 could look like. So Dinesh is dealing with those different scenarios through here. We've used the path that has the one padding on there to get the value and then pass that value back. So if I actually look at this raw output here, this is basically what came back from Azure AD after we validated that token. And deeper down in here somewhere, I should see my user principal name. There we go. My UPN, or my user principal name, is the name that I logged into Azure AD with. That's kind of the key to identify who's running this. Remember, I logged in as that staff user. We actually see it there. So that wasn't entered by the user. It was securely provided by them logging into the site, us doing that get token, passing the token to logic apps, and logic apps figuring that out. So there's a fair bit of plumbing to get that working and together. But once you've done it once, you can reuse it and repurpose it from there. Now, the other thing that we do, if I come back to my resource group here, there's this other logic app called Get User Info. This is the second piece. And we were doing this in the main Power Automate in Tuesday's session. We've broken it out into its own piece here. And basically what happens is we pass the user principal name of what came back from that security check to this one here. What we want to do is go get some information about that employee. So if you remember in Tuesday's session, we were creating JSON files for every employee that has things like what's their employee number, their display name, how do they fit into the organizational structure, who's their manager, all the things that we need to manage these processes. So this is basically going to get that file, just like we did in Power Automate, and parsing it out to get that employee data. So we can see the details of that staff member. So we've taken that user principal name that came back from Azure AD, and now we know everything about that person, including their manager's information. What we don't know when we want to post the actual expense form to the list is what's the employee ID in SharePoint for that user. SharePoint keeps its own unique one. And I raised a challenge I had on Tuesday, translating from an email address to a SharePoint user ID, but some of these people that I'm working with, because I'm using different plans in 365, don't have email addresses. There's an F3 plan for your frontline workers that only gives them Teams, doesn't give them email. How do we deal with that? Tom, one of our senior developers, helped me out with that, with this ensure user call out, which basically just takes a user principal name and gives you back the SharePoint ID to that user. So I've kind of solved that one. Thank you, Tom, on that side. So we can get the employee ID, which is sort of this, kind of hard to see there, this number here, which is sort of an internal representation in SharePoint of that user that you need. And we need to do the same thing with the manager as well. And then what we can do is we can take all that complex data that came back and format it as a nice simple piece of JSON, make it easier for the other logic app to consume it. So what's the employee number, names, user principal name, manager information, SharePoint user IDs, it's all in there and easy to consume. So we just pass it as a response back to the caller. So if I come back to my logic app here, where it calls that get user info, boom, there I can see all of that detail about the user. So again, as I build more workflows like this, I can use that single logic app as a helper for all of those different workflows. So now we get into the meat of actually putting something into SharePoint. So a couple of things I need to touch on here. Let's actually get under the hood in the SharePoint library itself. So let's have a look at one of those requests that just went through. So let's use the 7750. That's the one that I sent as the first demo through. So let's edit this record in SharePoint. So this is what we want to create in SharePoint. The reason I had to do those lookups to get the SharePoint user IDs was because I'm using people columns in here, and SharePoint needs the ID in order to put a person into a people column, because we want the actual people record of the employee in here. We want the actual people record of the manager in here. We know that staff member 2 reports up to me, so we've got that structure in there. Now, I didn't get a chance to populate all the fields in here. I was just populating the grand total, but the model would apply to all the other fields through here as well. But the one I want to highlight is down here. We've got this expense form JSON data. And the reason that we do this is we want to take that complete set of data that got submitted with the expense form and save it in its raw form into the SharePoint list. And SharePoint's not going to do anything with it. But remember, at the beginning of the talk, I talked about the ability to open up an existing expense form, change it, and resubmit it. But we need all of the detail in order to do that. And this piece isn't on this version of the form. We have it in that richer example that I was talking about before. We're going to actually read that data back from SharePoint and fill in all the form fields, including those arrays of mileages and expenses and such. So you've got a fully populated form as you last saved it. You can make changes to it and resubmit it. And to my earlier point, if we add some new fields to that form that we want to capture through that process, again, none of this needs to change because we're taking that whole expense form JSON block and saving it into SharePoint. So that new data is going to get saved in here, and that's all going to hang together from that point of view. Unless one of those fields drives something that I want to explicitly call out in the SharePoint list. And typically what we put in the SharePoint list is things like totals. We don't need to see, every meal and every trip that I took in the summary data in SharePoint. That's okay to have in the form data and open up the form to be able to see that detail. What we want to be able to show in this view here is things like these totals. And you can do interesting things in SharePoint, sum up those across grouped staff members and such, and start to build some nice dashboard views around that. So if we come back to our logic app here, I know I'm jumping back and forth between a lot of different things. Apologies if I'm losing you through here, but basically we want to get that full set of submitted JSON data. Now, what we did to do is do some HTML encoding on it, so it doesn't interpret it as JSON. It interprets it just as a big string that it's going to store into SharePoint. So we manipulate it. We've got some formulas in here that do some encoding of double quotes and things like that in there, so it doesn't get interpreted as JSON. It just gets submitted in through there. And then here we're actually pulling out some of those specific fields. So we're creating a variable for our grand total. We're parsing our totals because there's our grand total that we want to pull out in there. The way that the JSON is structured, this is set up as an array. Now we're never going to have multiple rows of totals, but Logic App doesn't know that. So it's going to put this for each loop in and say, spin through each array set that you've got in there and grab the grand total out there. Now we don't worry about multiple runs through here. We know there never will be. We'll always see a 1 of 1 through there. And now we've got the value of 0 that was submitted in the grand total. In fact, let's go back to our earlier run here that actually had some data in there. So if we look at this one now, we see our 7750 that we submitted in there. Okay, so we've got that value. So now we want to actually put that into SharePoint. Now we're not using the out of the box, just create a list item in SharePoint action in Logic Apps or Power Automate. We're doing this send an HTTP request. The reason for that, and we haven't fully implemented here, is we want to put it into an employee folder so that it's properly secured. I covered that in Tuesday's session, how we want to make sure that the employee can see their stuff, their manager and their manager's manager have visibility, and all that security is properly managed through those folders. That's why we have to do it as a post request rather than using the standard actions. But we can see here we're building up a body of all the fields that we want to set in SharePoint, and these correspond to list columns into SharePoint. So if we look back here at our expenses list, and I say, hey, I want to look at the list settings on this. You know, these columns here that all have names, they all match to what we're setting in here. We're saying, take what came from the form and put it into the title column for each of those items. Put that 7750 into the grand total. You know, take that whole block of form data and just dump it all in as one big string into the expenses list through there. That all came back, so we're all good to go. And this is kind of where the Logic app ends and the Power Automate is going to pick up. So the idea is to say, okay, let's build a Power Automate. Sorry, I'm jumping into the wrong ones here. That triggers off of new items going in the expense list. And the way we set up the permissions on here is nobody gets to touch this list directly. Even if it's my expenses, I still only have read-only access to the list. And that's really important. We don't want people to be able to come in and game the rules and say, hey, I'm going to increase my total even though my items don't add up to that. You know, they shouldn't be able to edit things like that. And you can't do what's called column level security, saying you can edit this field but not that field in SharePoint. It's just not possible. So the best way to address that is to say, well, we're going to lock people out so they have read-only access through that. And the only way that it can manipulate that is by actually going through the form and resubmitting a change. Oh, this is the big form, sorry. And resubmitting a change, and we can go through all the business validation rules and make sure everything's secure in the Logic app before that change gets saved. So that's kind of the goal. Is from a security point of view, we want everything funneling through that Logic app. So the only way that something shows up in this list is because the Logic app properly validated it, said it's acceptable, it's ready to go, and it's written that to the list. So then we can build a Power Automate from there that says, hey, if a new item shows up in here whose status is submitted, we know we need to start an approval workflow, which maybe is a one-step approval that goes to their manager. That works for Envision IT. In the other work that I was talking about, it goes to the manager first, and then it goes to the finance team as a second stage approval. And then once it's completed, it goes into that SAP upload queue from there. So we can use Power Automate and all the richness of the approvals in there with the Teams integration, which I love, as part of that process. But we haven't put ourselves into the situation where we're in premium licensing for Power Automate, because Logic app does the heavy technical pieces and then Power Automate does the approval side. So you can actually blend the two together and use them together as part of one through there. So why don't we pause for a sec? We've got a couple good questions in there. So so the first question from Arun talking about when calling to submit Logic app, how do we authenticate and secure that call? So let's come back to the Logic app itself. There's a couple of key pieces that I breezed over that need to be part of that. So we have to look at the authorization for the Logic app. I don't think I have time to get completely under the hood here, but we should maybe do a follow-up article about this. But basically what you need to do is you need to register an application in Azure AD. That'll give you a client ID for that application. And we register an issue or an audience in Logic app for that. And it's basically saying, for me to call this Logic app, I need to provide a token against this application. So if we come back to the actual Logic app itself, if we look at this here, there's a post URL that comes through as part of this. Let me just copy this and throw it up in Notepad so it's a little easier to see. So by default, when you call Logic apps, there's what's called a shared access secret, a signature that you need to pass that I've highlighted there, which basically proves that you're allowed to call this Logic app. The problem is if I put that signature here in the JavaScript, everybody can see it. Everybody can do what I did and hit F12 and go into developer toolbar, say, hey, now I've got the secret. I can just start posting stuff to that logic app and it's not going to do any validation. It says you've got the secret. I'm going to trust you. That's a bad idea. Managing security through the JavaScript, yes, you need to be a somewhat sophisticated user, but it's not that difficult to do. So when we put the URL in here, we can't pass that signature because we're doing the Azure AD authenticated security. So when we're back at the expense form, because we've set up this authorization here, you have to pass that bearer token across, and that's how the security happens from that point of view. That was the secret sauce here. Another question from Anonymous, there was a problem. Looks like people couldn't access the application. I don't know if that was just for one person or people in general aren't able to get in through there. We tested with our own separate tenant, but there may be still some things. I think we have some external users set up in there, so maybe we didn't do that properly. So apologies if you weren't able to hit that. Maybe what we can do is test that out a little broader with some other tenants, see if that works, and in the follow-up notes that we'll send up tomorrow with the recordings, we can give you an update on that side. In terms of how we did the actual authoring of the HTML editor, really that's up to you. I mean, you can literally author it right here in the app service editor. You can use Visual Studio Code or full Visual Studio or Notepad. That's the beauty of it is there's no tool restrictions on here. It's just a pure plain HTML form. In fact, you can take this form as it is. There's a little bit of Azure AD authentication that's happening in the form that gets in the way. But if you take that piece out, you can actually run it as a standalone form. You just put the HTML on your C drive, run your browser against that. So as a developer, it becomes very easy to develop and debug and work through from that point of view. And the same is true for the JavaScript and the CSS. Choose your tool and go ahead and author that from that point of view. So then there's a question about in the logic app where you submitted the HTTP request to the SharePoint list, where did you specify the folder that the new item goes in? So that's the piece that I'm still missing in there. In fact, if I come back, see if I'm in the right one. Yeah. So this is the Power Automate flow from the leave request example that I was showing on Tuesday. I can show you in this one here. So this one's a little different. It doesn't need to do all the bearer token security stuff at the beginning that the other one does, because it's already locked down that the leave request form is a Microsoft form, and that's secured through Azure AD, and it's already got security to the Power Automate as part of that. So this was a little simpler there. All those steps for getting the employee data we've got inline in this flow. So those I'd like to pull out just like I did on the logic app side. In fact, I'm curious, haven't tested it yet. Can I call out to a logic app step from a Power Automate? That would be interesting to see how that hangs together. But down here, after we do the, here's where we're actually posting the item in. So right here, the first item in the body is actually passing a path. So it's specifying the path to the list, in this case, to the leave requests. And it's actually using the user principal name as part of the path. So that puts it into the folder for the right user as part of that submission. I was having some challenges getting that working on my logic app, so I just took it out for the time being, but I'm going to put that back in and get that hanging together. So we should see those items showing up in the proper folder from there. Question on the licensing side, how cost effective is this compared to Power App with CDS? So the beauty of this solution is, as I mentioned, our goal was to keep it within non-premium licensing. So everything that we're doing, the logic app is consumption-based. The pricing I talked about in Tuesday's session, Power Automate versus logic apps, it's tiny consumption pricing on the logic apps. It's tens of millions of a dollar per action in your logic app. So you need a lot of runs to add up to even dollars per month in terms of consumption from that point of view. Versus you get into Power Apps, I mean, you could be in a scenario where you're looking at the $40 a month for the full Power Apps CDS type of licensing per user. Say you got 1,000 users in your organization, we're talking $40,000 a month. You would never spend that money just to do an expense form. But if you're doing lots of other things in Power Apps and CDS, absolutely it makes sense to do this here. This becomes one of the challenges with employee self-service. Depending on the model that you pick, sometimes the licensing becomes prohibitive for one example in there. But if you've got enough things leveraging that and pulling that, it makes sense. So it's very much a depends kind of answer. Apologies on that, but that's how it hangs together from that perspective. Okay. I think I've covered most of the technical bits through there. Let me just come back to my deck here. I know I've got a couple of wrap-up slides in here. I did have one talking about the pricing differences between Power Automate and Logic Apps. So the pricing per action on the Logic App side, there's a lot of zeros in front of there versus the licensing here. I mean, Power Automate, if you've got enough people in your organization, the $100 per flow per month, as long as you've got the 5 flow minimum in there, makes a lot of sense as well. That's a pretty cost-effective way of doing it. So it really depends on how broadly you're using this within your organization. It's often tough to justify the licensing on one particular business case, but if there's a broader business case there, it can absolutely make a lot of sense. Coming back on the security side of things, don't do security through obscurity. Don't use the shared access secret in your JavaScript, because somebody can look at that pretty easily and directly access your Logic app and do things badly from there. Make sure you use the tokens and the proper security from that perspective. Make sure you do the right validation. We're not doing that in our Logic app right now. We should be cross-checking things to say, hey, if we add up all of the items that we've got in there, did the total match the total? Because maybe somebody, again, through developer toolbar, you can actually set a breakpoint like I showed you, modify the data before it gets posted, and suddenly you're posting something different into your expenses. The Logic app shouldn't trust what the front end form is doing. It's called zero trust security, where each level doesn't trust what the other level is doing. Absolutely leverage Azure Active Directory, both from a permissions and a manager reporting structure. You've got the right folders and permissions set up through there, that you can deal with changes through that process. You've thought about mobile and bring your own device. I didn't show the view in here, but if I come back to the expense form, and I bring my developer toolbars back up for a sec, let me flip that into a mobile view. We've used Bootstrap when we've laid this form out, so it actually lays out really nicely from a mobile device point of view. You can see what was sort of a horizontal tabular table view has turned into a stacked view where I stack up my items for my expenses through here. What you don't want to do is scroll back and forth when you're on a phone, so this vertical stacking approach makes a lot of sense. And you can play with your developer toolbar to say, hey, if I'm on an iPad Pro, what does that look like? Where we're back to more of a desktop style. And as a developer, you can set those breakpoints and manage what that experience looks like quite richly through there. So that's the other advantage, over Power Apps. Power Apps doesn't give you necessarily the same level of control from a responsive design point of view. We've got really granular pixel level control when we're designing the HTML. That's good and bad. I mean, you need a strong web stack developer to build a form like this, but then the tool doesn't get in the way and they can do whatever they want from that perspective. This was a bit of the information architecture. I talked on this on Tuesday's session, so that's in the recording there. And just wrap-up points. These are actually the same wrap-up points from Tuesday. The tool choice doesn't need to be one size fits all. You might have a combination of Power Apps and HTML forms and Microsoft Forms for different purposes through there. But really understand the licensing implications of that. What do you get with your 365 licensing versus what gets you into premium licensing? How are you dealing with mobile? Bring your own device. Broken record, I know, but do your security properly, and make sure your Azure AD is properly set up. It's fully populated. And start with something simple. Maybe that leave request example or something like that from Microsoft Forms is a great way to get your feet wet. On the security side, I actually have my next series coming up is around secure development and software development lifecycle. So that's happening in April and May. And I've actually got some additional sessions coming up. Next one is on document collection with external parties. This is all about how you do things like collect and distribute documents securely to a large group of external users. And then the last one later in May on using multiple planner boards and Power BI. How do we do things like portfolio management, where I want to see and visualize how my staff are being allocated across my multiple projects in multiple portfolios. And we actually have a municipal partner we're going to be announcing as part of that presentation that's actually leveraging that. So with that, we're right at the top of the hour. I want to say thank you to everybody for joining the session. Hope I didn't go too fast and get too deep in there. There's a lot of technical, particularly in this one. But if you've got questions, absolutely reach out. One thing I should have put in the slides are actually looking to take some of these topics and talks and do them as private talks with clients. We've actually got a couple clients lined up with that already to say, hey, let's slow the pace down, make it contextual to what we're looking to do as an organization, get some knowledge transfer going with our developers and our IT team. Happy to lead sessions like that. So by all means, reach out. We can follow up from that perspective. So with that, I'll bid you adieu. Have a great rest of your day. I hope you enjoyed the series. Thanks very much.